Dawn spilled over the dense tropical rainforest, golden rays piercing through thick canopies like glowing arrows, painting shimmering streaks of light on the damp earth below. The gentle murmur of a nearby stream blended with the chorus of birdsong, composing a symphony that heralded the start of a new story. In the depths of a thicket, inside a warm cave lined with dry leaves, a tigress was in labor. Her breath came in heavy bursts, mingling with the scent of soil and fresh grass. Low guttural growls rumbled from her chest, a primal call to life, and then, one by one, tiny tiger cubs emerged into the world. Among them was the smallest male of the litter, yet his eyes shone unusually bright, as though carrying an unquenchable flame. The mother gently licked his damp fur, the comforting warmth of her milk enveloping her newborns. Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves, and the forest carried on its eternal rhythm, unaware that a future king had just opened his eyes. In her heart, the tigress gave the little male a name, aka meaning flame. From his very first moments, aka was not content to simply curl up in warmth. He dared to crack open his eyes toward the light beyond the cave, where the vast green world was calling. In Aka's realm, life and death were separated by no more than a breath, yet for now, wrapped in his mother's embrace, surrounded by the scent of decaying leaves and fresh sap, he was only a fragile creature, unaware that one day his roar would echo across the jungle like a mighty anthem of the true lord of the forest. No 2 days in the forest were ever the same. Some mornings aka awoke to the gentle mist of rain filtering through the canopy, each droplet catching the faint glow of dawn like tiny shards of glass. On other days, the air was heavy with heat, and the sun's rays pierced through the foliage, scattering golden flecks across the damp forest floor. But no matter the weather, every day in Aka's young life brought a lessons that would never be written in words, but carved into his instincts, dictating whether he would live or die. His mother was his first and greatest teacher. She taught him how to place each paw so silently that the ground itself seemed not to notice, how to distribute his weight so that even the most brittle twig would not snap underfoot, how to halt instantly at the faintest sound, ears swiveling toward the source, and to listen not just with hearing but with his entire being. Every sound in the forest was a message, the alarm call of birds warning of a predator, the rustle of leaves signaling prey in motion, and sometimes, the sudden, unnerving silence that meant danger was close. At first aka was clumsy and impatient. He often pounced too soon, scattering prey before he got within striking distance. Once, he crept toward a pheasant, only to blunder into a dry branch that cracked like a gunshot, sending the bird flapping into the trees. His mother never roared in anger. She only fixed him with a steady amber gaze, eyes deep as the oldest tree roots, as if saying, "The forest must forget you before you can touch it." Training took place everywhere beside the river's edge. In the dense undergrowth, beneath towering fig trees whose roots twisted like the bones of the earth. Sometimes, his mother vanished into the foliage without a sound, leaving only the faintest of trails. Aka was forced to follow her scent, weaving through thorny bamboo, navigating slippery logs, and learning that persistence mattered as much as strength. There were times when he found her, crouched in the shadows, watching him with quiet approval. Other times, he returned to the den, exhausted, muscles sore, pride bruised. But every failure was another stone in the foundation of his survival. One moonlit night, his mother led him to the riverbank. The water shimmered under the pale silver light, reflecting the forest as though it were another world. Across the river, a sambar deer grazed lazily, unaware of the two shadows watching it. His mother flicked her tailor signal. Aka's heartbeat roared in his ears. This time, he remembered everything she had taught him. Lower himself, move slowly, keep his breathing shallow. He crept forward, closing the distance one measured step at a time. The world seemed to shrink, until there was only him, the deer, and the cool night air between them. Then, in a coiled burst of muscle, he leaped. But the deer's instincts were quick. It sprang away, splashing into the water and vanishing into the darkness. Aka landed in the mud, breathless, his claws empty. He expected his mother's disappointment. Instead, she padded to his side, touched her head gently to his shoulder, and rumbled a low, approving growl. It was not a victory, but it was progress. And progress, he began to understand, was the true currency of the wild. From that night, aka realized that strength alone was not enough. A king of the forest needed patience, precision, and the ability to listen to the pulse of the jungle itself. Every step had to be more than movement, it had to be strategy. Every breath had to blend with the rhythm of the world around him. The forest taught him more than how to hunt, it taught him how to survive. He learned to avoid the coiled danger of a green pit viper camouflaged on a branch, to recognize the distant chatter of macaques as an alarm, and to retreat when the deep united howls of dholes carried through the trees. Once, he and his mother crossed paths with a leopard, golden and spotted like sunlight broken through leaves. Instead of fighting, his mother silently led him away. It was then he learned another truth. Sometimes wisdom lay not in standing your ground, but in knowing when to walk away. Seasons turned, the rains came and went. AKA grew leaner and stronger, his muscles hardening, his coat sleek and shining in the sun. Small scars marked his body, each with its own story: a slip during a hunt, a scratch from a wild boar's tusk, a brush with thorny undergrowth. But the most visible change was in his eyes. They no longer held the round softness of a cub, they had sharpened into the focused gaze of a predator. One late afternoon, a warm wind swept in from the valley, carrying a scent unlike any AKA had known before. His mother lifted her head, nostrils flaring. AKA too caught the heavy musk arrival, male tiger. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling roar that echoed off the hills like distant thunder. It was a challenge, a declaration of power. Aka's gaze turned toward the sound, and for the first time, he felt a pull deep in his chest, yearning not just to survive, but to prove himself. But the time was not yet right. There were still lessons to learn, skills to sharpen. The forest still held countless secrets, and he would need every one of them, if he hoped to one day claim a territory of his own. That night, Aka lay beside his mother, the cool wind rustling the leaves above them. He listened to the forest's heartbeat, the chorus of insects, the sigh of the trees, the distant splash of fish breaking the river's surface. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet space between breaths, he dreamed of the day his roar would travel farther than the rivals. A roar that would mark him not just as a survivor, but as the unchallenged ruler of the ancient forest. The dry season had tightened its grip on the forest. Leaves curled and fell in brittle spirals, crunching faintly under Aka's paws. The streams that once sang with rainwater now murmured softly, reduced to narrow ribbons of flow. In the lean months, every creature in the jungle moved with a sharper edge to their hunger, and hunger made them dangerous. For Aka, now in the prime of his youth, the forest felt both familiar and unpredictable. He knew the favored paths of the samba herds, the hidden wallows where wild boar cooled themselves in midday heat, and the high ridges where the breeze carried scents from miles away. But that knowledge brought him no comfort on this particular morning. The warning came in scent before sound. A musk he had never encountered this strongly before, sharp, heavy, with an undercurrent of iron. His muscles tightened. This was no deer, no boar, and not even the fading trail of another tiger. It was something alien to his world, and yet utterly at home here. Then came the sound, not the roar of a cat, but the coarse, collective growl of many throats. It was layered, fast, and overlapping, a sound with no single source but a moving mass. AKA froze, his tail stiff, his ears swiveled toward the noise, and the jungle seemed to dim round him. Out of the bamboo shadows they came, dholes, a dozen of them, their coats a burnished red, legs quick and sure on the forest floor. Their eyes were bright with a feverish coordination, their jaws slick with old blood. AKA had heard of them from his mother's cautionary growls. They were not large alone, but together they were a single, relentless organism. The pack fanned out in silence first, then closed with the suddenness of a trap snapping shut. Ika's instincts screamed to run, but running meant giving them the hunt they craved. He backed slowly, eyes locked on the closest dhole, shoulders squared. From the ridge above, his mother appeared, a silent shadow that became a roar. The sound cut through the pack's confidence like a blade. She charged, striking the nearest dhole with a paw that sent it rolling into the undergrowth. For a heartbeat, the forest erupted into chaos. Snarls, snapping teeth, the sharp scent of fear and rage. But dholes did not scatter icily. They regrouped with eerie speed, circling now to cut Ika off from his mother. His heart pounded as he realized what they wanted: to separate, to isolate, to exhaust. His mother's roar came again, sharper this time, and she surged toward him, brushing her flank against his in a silent command. Move. They turned as one, not running blindly, but flowing through the forest in a series of controlled retreats, dodging between thick buttressed roots. Weaving through thorny thickets, the dogs hesitated to enter. The chase was a test of endurance. Aka's breath burned in his chest, each inhalation filled with a taste of dust and adrenaline. The dholes were tireless, their voices overlapping in a chorus that seemed to mock his effort. But his mother led with uncanny precision, choosing paths that narrowed to single body widths. forcing the pack to slow or split. Finally, they reached the river. The dry season had thinned it, but its current was still swift and deep. Without hesitation, his mother plunged in, her striped body cutting the water like a living spear. Aka followed, the cold biting into his muscles. Behind them, the dholes barked and yipped at the bank, unwilling to commit to the crossing. When Aka dragged himself onto the far shore, his legs trembled. His mother shook the water from her coat, eyes scanning the opposite bank, until the last red shape vanished into the trees. Only then did she approach him, touching her nose briefly to his cheek. No growl, no lecture, just that brief connection, as if to say, "You lived, learn why." That night, lying in the damp shelter of a fallen tree, aka replayed every moment of the chase, the circling, the splitting, the relentless pace. He understood now. The forest did not care how strong he was, only how well he could adapt. A fight was not always won by claws and teeth, it was won by knowing when to stand and when to move, when to be a wall and when to be water. Above the canopy, the dry season moon shone pale and watchful. Aka closed his eyes, but the rhythm of the dholes' voices still echoed in his Skolnatus fear. But as a reminder, his kingdom, when he claimed it, would not be won once and held forever. Every day, every season, the forest would ask him the same question: "Are you ready to fight for it again?" And when that day came, he swore his answer would be yes. The rains returned with a vengeance. For days, the forest was wrapped in silver veils of water, every leaf trembling under the weight of droplets, every hollow filled to brimming. The rivers that had shrunk to lazy streams during the dry season now surged with brown, roaring water, swallowing banks and reshaping the land. Too, aka the change felt like the forest itself had drawn in a long, cleansing breath. But with the rains came something else, an energy in the air, restless and heavy. He had grown in the months since the dhole encounter. His shoulders were broader, his stride surer, his senses sharper. The lessons of patience, of precision, of knowing when to fight and when to yield, had taken root. But nothing in his life so far had prepared him for the moment he first heard the roar. It was unlike the distant calls of roaming males he'd heard before. This one was closer, deeper, each note rolling like a drumbeat through the soaked jungle. It was not a question, it was a claim, a declaration. "This is mine." Aka's muscles tightened as if the sound had reached into him and pulled on every nerve. His ears swiveled forward, nostrils flaring to catch the scent on the wind. Heavy musk, layered with the raw tang of a recent kill. The stranger was not just passing through, he was feeding here, inside the territory aka had begun to think of as his own. His mother no longer patrolled with him. In the past weeks, they had drifted apart, the way tigers must when youth turns to independence. He was alone now, and the decision of what to do was his alone. The rain eased as he moved, each step a deliberate choice, paws sinking into the wet earth with barely a sound. The forest was hushed except for the steady drip from the canopy. Soon he saw the signs. Claw marks gouged into the smooth bark of a tree high enough to dwarf even Ika's reach. The scent here was fresh, sharp, defiant. Then he saw him. The stranger stood over the remains of a boar, his head lifting slowly as aka emerged from the shadows. His coat was darker than Aka's, his frame massive, built of thick muscle and heavy bone. His face bore the pale scars of old battles, and his amber eyes held no fear, only the steady measure of a fighter weighing his opponent. They circled each other without sound. The air between them was charged, almost electric. Aka's tail lashed once. The stranger's whiskers flared forward. Then, without warning, the other male roared a sound so loud and deep it seemed to shake water from the leaves. It was the last warning aka would get. Aka roared back. His own voice surprised him with its force, not just in sound but in the way it surged from deep in his chest, carrying every lesson, every trial, every moment of survival. And then they collided. The impact was like two storms meeting. Muscles bunched and strained, claws slashed for purchase, jaws snapped inches from throats. They rolled in the mud, water splashing around them, each trying to throw the other off balance. Aka's mind became a blur of instinct: feint left, strike low, twist when he lunges. The stranger was stronger, but Aka was faster. Twice he slipped free of crushing blows, answering with quick strikes to the shoulder and flank. But the older male knew how to endure pain, how to bide his moment. A heavy paw caught aka across the face, sending him staggering. Blood mingled with rain on his cheek, the metallic taste flooding his mouth. Pain sharpened him. His vision tunneled, focusing only on the opponent's breathing, the slight hitch in his stance where Aka's claws had raked earlier. When the stranger lunged again, aka sidestepped and drove forward, slamming his weight into the exposed side. The older male stumbled, and in that heartbeat of imbalance, aka struck his jaws clamping onto the thick fur of the neck, not to kill, but to claim dominance. The stranger twisted, broke free, and stepped back. For a long moment, they locked eyes, rain pattering between them. Then, with a low growl, the older tiger turned and slipped into the forest, his massive form melting into shadow. Aka stood alone in the clearing, his breath ragged, his body aching. The boar carcass lay abandoned. He didn't eat right away. He stood there, letting the rain wash the blood and mud from his fur, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He had not killed, but he had won. That night, his roar rolled through the drenched forest. It was not a challenge this time, it was an answer, and every creature who heard it understood. A new ruler had risen in this corner of the jungle. The rain softened in the days after the battle, leaving the forest washed clean, every leaf vivid with the green of renewed life. But for aka, the air smelled different now, less like the shared wilderness of a young wanderer, and more like something his own muscles and blood had claimed. This was no longer a place he simply passed through, it was his. From the moment the rival tiger disappeared into the trees, the work of keeping a kingdom had begun. Aka patrolled daily, not out of restlessness, but necessity. The borders had to speak, and his voice sent marks on trees. Deep claw grooves raked high on trunks. The paths he cut through the undergrowth with the weight of his body. Every mark was a message to the unseen eyes and noses that passed this way. This land is taken. He learned quickly that ruling meant more than dominance, it meant vigilance. A ruler's absence was an invitation, and the jungle never lacked for those willing to test its edges. On his second patrol, aka caught the faint musk of a leopard drifting near the southern ridge. The scent was fresh, and though leopards avoided direct fights with full-grown tigers, they were opportunists. This one had likely followed the wild pig herds into Aka's range. He tracked it silently, moving downwind until the shadow-spotted shape came into view. The leopard froze when it saw him, body low, tail twitching. For a heartbeat, tension coiled between them. Aka didn't need to strike. Instead, he closed the gap slowly, his bulk filling the narrow animal trail, until there was nowhere left to retreat but away. The leopard broke first, melting into the canopy with the effortless grace of its kind. Aka did not chase. His point had been made without blood. Food was plentiful now, but he hunted with discipline, never depleting the same ground twice in a row. He stalked sambar and chital in the open glades after dawn, and at night, he would slip to the river to wait for wild boar coming to drink. The kill was not just for himself. When he left the bones in a clearing, he knew his scent would mingle with the carcass, reinforcing his claim to the land. His nights were rarely silent. The forest always spoke, owls calling from high perches, frogs singing in the low wetlands, the distant crack of bamboo when elephants moved through. But more often now, he heard the faint roars of other tigers beyond his borders. They were not the long, rolling calls of travelers passing by. They were shorter, probing, testing. One evening, from the northern edge of his range, aka heard an answering roar too close. He moved toward it, slow and deliberate, weaving through the trees until the ground dipped into a shallow ravine. The scent reached him first. Young male, hungry for more than just food. Aka did not rush. He stood in the shadows, the moon breaking through the clouds to stripe his fur in silver. Then he roared, not in rage, but in a deep, measured tone that filled the ravine like water in a hollow. The sound carried far, the low end vibrating through the earth itself. The young male did not answer. The silence that followed was its own kind of victory. Yet rulership was not only about fending off challengers. It was also about knowing the pulse of the land when the herds moved, when the fruiting trees drew prey in numbers, when the droughts would tighten every creature's throat with thirst. Aka walked the same trails daily, not because he had forgotten them, but because they needed to know him. The ground under his paws, the branches he brushed, the streams he drank from, all of it had to carry his story. The rain's retreat brought heat. Pools shrank, grass turned brittle, and prey began to move more often in search of water. This meant strangers would pass through, deer, wild pigs, even the occasional sloth-burrich one bringing new scents that tangled with his own. Aka adjusted his patrols, checking the watering holes at dawn and dusk, keeping them free of threats. One dusk, he found the fresh prints of a tigress near the eastern marsh, smaller than his own, lighter but confident. She had crossed into his territory during the night and hunted here before leaving. The air still held her scent, musky, warm, with the faint temps of wet fur. Aka paused, the wind stirring his whiskers. The encounter would not be like facing another male. It was not a threat, but a possibility. The forest had its cycles, and the call to pass on his bloodline was as much a part of his reign as defending it. For now, he turned back toward the heart of his range. The night was thick with the scent of rain yet to fall, and somewhere in the dark, an owl called once, twice, before falling silent. Arka's paws moved steadily, each step pressing his claim into the earth. This was his kingdom won in the mud, written in scent and claw. But he knew the jungle well enough to understand that every crown here was temporary. One day, another roar would come, closer and stronger, asking the same question he had once asked his rival. Will you fight for this? And when that day came, AKA would be ready to answer again. The heat lingered in the forest like a held breath. Days began with the metallic taste of dew and ended in the heavy stillness. Before the night insects began their chorus, prey had grown restless. Their movements stretched beyond familiar routes in search of water and fresh grazing. For AKA this meant his patrols had doubled not out of fear, but because a ruler could not afford to know his land only in part. It was during one of these patrols, at the break between dusk and night, that he caught her scent again. The tigress. It came on the breeze from the eastern marsh. Warm, earthy, edged with the faint sweetness of a recent kill. It was a scent unlike the musk of rival males, less a challenge, more an invitation. AKA paused, nostrils flaring, reading the freshness of the trail she had passed through in the last few hours, crossing into his territory with the casual confidence of one who did not fear his presence. He followed. The marshland was quiet save for the soft chirring of frogs and the distant splash of a heron lifting from the shallows. The air here was thick, clinging to his fur, carrying the fragrance of damp soil and the tang of rotting leaves. Her tracks were clear in the mud, smaller than his, but firm, each step deep with purpose. When he saw her, she was crouched at the water's edge, drinking. The moonlight traced the lines of her body, strong shoulders, sleek flanks, the ripple of muscle under striped gold and shadow. Her ears twitched, catching his approach before her head turned. For a moment, they simply watched each other. No roar, no grouch, the slow exchange of breath and scent. AKA stepped forward, low and measured, his tail moving in a slow, fluid arc. She did not retreat. They circled once, twice, their whiskers brushing in a silent greeting. This was no territory fight. This was the beginning of something older than rivalry, older than even the forest itself, the call to ensure their kind's survival. The days that followed were different. Ika's patrols were shared now. The tigress moved with him, her steps confident but never careless. They hunted together once, bringing down a young sambar at the edge of the southern glade. Their combined strength, a fluid, practiced strike. She fed first, and he watched with a quiet satisfaction. In this season, the rules of dominance softened. Survival was no longer his alone to guard, but as the bond between them deepened, AKA began to notice changes at the edges of his world. It began with a scent unlike any the forest had taught him to read, sharp, acrid, and alien. It clung to the undergrowth in the western reaches of his territory, along with faint indentations in the soil round, patterned, and repeating in perfect symmetry. The trail did not belong to any creature he knew. On another evening, while stalking near the northern ridge, he heard it. A low, distant hum that did not belong to the forest. It rose and fell, steady, mechanical, unlike the voices of wind or water. Birds lifted in sudden alarm far ahead, and the scent of smoke drifted in on the breeze. The tigress noticed it too. Her ears flattened, and she melted into the shadows beside him, the two of them silent and still as the sound grew nearer. Through the curtain of trees, faint glimmers of light appeared in natural light, white and harsh, moving in beams that swept across the ground. Figures emerged upright, two-legged, carrying long, angular shapes that caught the light. Their smell was the same acrid stench he had found before, mixed with the faint copper temps of blood and the sharp bite of metal. They moved with purpose, scanning the forest as though searching for something. AKA felt the tigress's muscles tighten beside him. His own instincts screamed to retreat deeper into the jungle, but something in him held still, not from curiosity, but from the cold realization that this was a danger unlike any other. The figures passed, their lights fading, the hum receding into the night, but the forest did not settle. Even the insects' songs seemed thinner, cautious. The scent of smoke lingered long after they were gone. When AKA and the tigress moved again, it was without sound, their paws carrying them back toward the heart of his territory. The moonlight followed them through the canopy, but the silver glow could not mask the shadow that had taken root in Arka's mind. The forest had taught him many lessons: how to stalk, how to fight, how to rule. But this was new. This was not a rival to outfight, nor a predator to evade. This was something that could change the shape of the jungle itself. And for the first time since claiming his kingdom, aka felt the weight of a question he could not yet answer. How do you defend a crown against a threat you cannot see until it is already upon you? The first rains of the new season came early, but they brought little relief. The downpours lasted only hours instead of days, leaving the air heavy with heat and the rivers only half swollen. 2, aka the rhythm of the forest felt off. Herds of chittle that normally grazed near the eastern clearings had shifted farther south. Wild boar were restless, their trails more erratic, as though driven by something unseen. The tigress stayed close now. She was heavy with cubs, her belly rounded, her movements slower but still careful. aka adapted his patrols to keep her within the safest parts of his territory. Dense groves with thick undergrowth where scent carried poorly, and narrow ridges where an approach could be seen long before it reached them. His hunts grew more frequent. She needed meat, and her own hunting had become rare. But the scent returned, that same acrid, metallic presence from the west. And this time, it did not pass through quickly. It lingered. One morning, Acre followed it to the edge of a place he knew well, a shallow glade, where the grass grew high and water pooled in a natural basin. But the grass had been flattened, not by herds, but by something heavy and deliberate. The ground bore deep circular impressions in neat rows, the smell of oil and heat still clinging to the soil. Beyond the glade, the trees were gone. In their place stood bare earth, raw and exposed, the roots of fallen giants jutting like broken bones. The air here tasted wrong, dry, dusty, carrying the faint sting of ash. Aka backed away, every muscle tense. Over the following nights, the forest spoke of the change. The distant hum returned, louder now, accompanied by sharp cracks that echoed like breaking branches but carried an unnatural rhythm. Birds abandoned their nests near the western edge. Monkeys traveled in silent urgency along the canopy, their alarm calls muted, as if sound itself might invite danger. Then came the night of the first fire. It began with a thin, acrid smoke curling under the trees, so faint aka almost mistook it for morning mist. But the scent deepened quickly, burning in his nose, prickling his eyes. The tigress rose from where she lay, ears flattened, and moved toward the cub Esten. She had chosen a hollow between tangled roots not far from a stream. Through the canopy, a glow began to spread, not the soft silver of the moon, but a restless orange, flickering and shifting. Aka knew fire only from rare lightning strikes, when storms split the sky and set a single tree alight. But this was different. The glow moved in a line, advancing like a predator too large to see in full. The animals of the forest moved as one. Deer, boar, lungers, and even predators crossed paths without conflict, driven by the shared instinct to flee. Aka guided the tigress toward the deeper ravines, keeping the stream's cool breath against his whiskers as they ran. Behind them, the glow grew brighter, and the crackling became a roar all its own. By dawn the fire had receded, leaving a scar of blackened earth and smoldering stumps where the undergrowth had once been thick. The air was quiet, but it was not peace. It was the uneasy silence of a wound still fresh. The tigress returned to her den, but her eyes lingered toward the west. Aka resumed his patrols, but the borders no longer felt fixed. The western edge was shifting inward, not from a rival's push, but from something that erased the forest itself. And deep inside, he knew the danger was not finished. Fire could be outrun, noise could be avoided, but whatever the humans were building beyond that line of ash, it would not stop at the trees they had already taken. For the first time since claiming his territory, Aka wondered if the jungle would still be here for his cubs to inherit. The rains returned in a sudden, drenching wave, as if the sky itself had decided to shield the forest from the heat and smoke that had haunted it. Water poured through the canopy, turning trails into streams, soaking the earth until the smell of ash faded into the richer scent of wet soil and green growth. For the tigress, the timing could not have been more critical. She had grown heavier in recent weeks, her pace slower, her breaths deeper. The hollow she had chosen for her den was hidden beneath the tangled roots of an ancient fig tree, its entrance masked by hanging vines and the soft splash of a nearby creek. Aka had helped secure the area in his own way, marking trees along every approach, patrolling tirelessly, and driving off any intruder bold enough to test the borders. On a grey dawn heavy with mist, the forest awoke to a new sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible beneath the rush of the creek, a tiny chorus of mewling cries. Aka stood just beyond the den's entrance, head low, ears forward. Inside, the tigress lay curled around 3 tiny cubs, each striped in miniature, their eyes sealed shut, their movements clumsy and searching. He did not enter. Instinct told him to keep his distance in these first days. to let the tigress guard them with the fierce, unbroken focus of a new mother. But he lingered nearby, his presence a silent promise. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every unfamiliar scent on the wind, drew him to his feet. The cubs grew quickly in the hidden dark of the den. By the time they opened their eyes, their legs were strong enough to stumble after their mother for a few paces before collapsing into the thick leaf litter. AKA often watched from a short distance as they played batting at each other's tails, tumbling clumsily, their tiny growls carrying a note of innocence he had never known in his own youth. But the forest outside their den was not as it had been when Akka was young. The western border still bore its scar. Even with the rains, the line of bare earth had widened. AKA had seen the humans again, more of them, carrying strange, sharp-smelling bundles. Some walked, others rode in loud, growling beasts with wheels that left deep, perfect tracks in the mud. Their scent lingered for days now, not hours. And prey was shifting. Herds that once moved freely through the western edge were now funneling deeper into the heart of his territory. This meant more food, but it also meant more predators, leopards, wild dogs, and even another young male tiger testing the southern ridge. The night of the first intrusion came during a heavy rain. AKA had been hunting along the river when the wind shifted, carrying to him the faint cries of his cubs, not playful, but sharp, urgent. He bounded through the mud, muscles burning, until the den came into sight. A lone dhole stood just beyond the entrance, its muzzle wrinkled, eyes bright with the reckless hunger of the desperate. The tigress was already in motion, her body a blur as she lunged, claws raking the air where the dog had been an instant before. Akka's roar split the rain, low and rolling, vibrating through the ground. The dhole fled, vanishing into the dark. AKA did not pursue. Instead, he stood beside the den, tail lashing, scanning the trees for movement. The cubs' cries quieted as the tigress settled back into place, her sides still heaving. That night, AKA did not sleep. He sat under the dripping fig roots, watching the rain sheet down over the entrance, listening to the steady heartbeat of the creek. The world beyond their den was tightening, borders shrinking, dangers multiplying. His cubs were small now, but they would grow. And when they did, they would need a forest still worth inheriting. AKA knew then that the battles ahead would not be only against tooth and claw. The enemy had many shapes, and some, like the humans, wounded the jungle in ways no single fight could heal. But as long as his paws touched the earth and his roar could still carry through the trees, he would not yield. This forest was his, and now it was theirs. The cubs were 3 moons old when they first stepped beyond the shadow of the den. Their stripes had deepened, their eyes were sharp with curiosity, and their paws, though still soft, carried the restless energy of youth. The tigress watched them closely, her body low, her tail flicking with each of their clumsy forays into the grass. AKA kept his patrols tight now, rarely straying far from the family's range. He had grown used to their scent, mingling with his own along the trails assigned to any creature that this ground was not just a male-less territory, but a home defended by 2 hunters. But the signs from the west grew worse. One morning while crossing a familiar ridge, AKA found the trail of a Samba herd cut through by something alien, deep grooves in the earth parallel and perfect, pressed into the mud by something heavier than any animal he knew. The scent was sharp and chemical, the same acrid burn that had haunted him for months. He followed it until the trees began to thin. What lay ahead made his hackles rise. The forest had been pushed back again, its edge ragged and raw. Fallen trunks lay piled like carcasses, their exposed wood pale against the dark soil. Beyond them, the ground was flattened into a wide path, churned by wheels and bootprints. And there were more sounds now. Metallic clanging, the grinding growl of machines that moved even without wind or muscle. Voices, human voices, rising and falling in a pattern he could not understand. AKA crouched low, his eyes narrowing as a figure stepped into view, 2-legged, carrying a long black shape that gleamed under the sun. Behind the figure came another, dragging a strange, box-like object on wheels. Both moved slowly, scanning the tree line as though searching. The wind shifted, and Akka scent carried toward them. One of the humans froze, turning sharply in his direction. A beam of light and natural blinding flashed across the shadows where he hid. His muscles coiled, ready to vanish deeper into the undergrowth. But a sharp crack split the air, louder than any thunder. A tree trunk just behind him spat splinters where the sound struck. AKA bounded away, melting into the green, his heart hammering. The crack came again, and again, each one chasing him until the forest thickened enough to swallow the sound. When he returned to the den, the tigress met him with a low growl. The cubs huddled between her legs. Their eyes were wide, their playfulness replaced with instinctive stillness. She sniffed him, catching the strange, bitter scent clinging to his fur. That night, aka patrolled the western edge alone. He moved in silence, every muscle tuned to the smallest disturbance. The humans were not just skirting the border anymore, they were stepping into the forest's heart. And they were carrying death in their hands. The next day, the cubs ventured farther during play, chasing each other through the ferns. Aka watched them, but his gaze kept drifting toward the west. He knew the time would come when they would wander beyond his sight, driven by the same curiosity that had once led him into his own battles. But the forest was no longer the one that had raised him. The old dangers, dolls, leopards, rival males could be fought with tooth and claw. This new one could kill from a distance, without warning, and without giving a chance to strike back. As the sun set, Arka climbed a low ridge and looked out over his kingdom. The night wind carried both the scents. He loved the wet earth, the musk of Dirand, the one he hated, bitter and alien. He knew then that the fight ahead would be unlike any he had faced before. To keep the forest for his cubs, he would have to fight an enemy that did not fear him, that did not speak the language of roars and scent marks. And that enemy was already inside his borders. The morning was thick with fog, the kind that clung to the fur and muted every sound. Aka moved through it like a shadow, his paws silent on the damp earth. The air was cool, but beneath it lingered the bitter tangth that had haunted him for moons. The humans were near again. The tigress remained at the den with the cubs, now old enough to wrestle and stalk each other in clumsy mimicry of the hunts they would one day master. She no longer left them unattended. The human scent had settled too close in recent nights. Aka followed the trail west, his nose reading the story in the soil. Fresh boot prints pressed deep into the mud, alongside the heavy grooves of wheeled machines. Broken branches carried the stink of oil, and the occasional splash of dark, sticky liquid clung to the leaves. The trail was so fresh he could taste it. He slowed when voices reached him, muffled but distinct in the fog. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no monkeys. Only the slow rhythm of human speech and the mechanical clink of metal against metal. He crept forward until the shapes emerged from the mist. There were 3 of them. 2 carried the long black sticks he had learned to fear. The third was bent over something on the ground, an antlered sambar stag, its flank torn by a wound that smelled of smoke and blood. They were cutting it apart, their movements efficient, the air around them heavy with the scent of death. Aka's ears flattened, a low growl rumbling in his chest before he could stop it. One of the men froze, his head jerking toward the sound. The growl grew, his body lowered, muscles coiling, tail lashing once. The fog seemed to close in around them, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the man lifted his weapon. The first crack split the air, a white-hot sound that seemed to rip through the fog itself. Pain seared along AK's flank as the shot grazed his skin, hot blood already slicking his fur. Instinct roared louder than the wound. He surged forward. The world became a blur of movement. He struck the nearest man first, the force of his leap sending them both crashing into the mud. Claws tore fabric, skin, and the sharp metallic smell of blood filled the air. The man screamed, his weapon falling uselessly to the side. The others shouted, their voices sharp with panic. Another crack rang out, the sound so close it rattled his skull. The ground near his paw exploded in a spray of mud. He spun, jaws snapping inches from the second man's leg, forcing him to stumble back. Then the third man fired. This one struck. True pain bloomed in his shoulder, deep and burning. The force drove him back, his breath ragged. But the fog was his ally. He melted into it, his striped body vanishing between the trees before the men could fire again. He ran until the scent of humans thinned, each step sending a lance of pain through his shoulder. When he finally slowed, his breaths came in harsh bursts, blood dripping into the leaves below. The forest around him was still, the mist curling low over the ground. By the time he reached the den, the tigress was waiting, her eyes locked on his wound, her ears flattening. The cubs mewed softly, pressing against her side as she sniffed the blood on his fur. He lowered himself into the cool mud beside the creek, letting the water wash over the injury. That night he lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of his mate and cubs. The humans had come closer than ever, and now, he had their scent burned into his memory, not just the acrid stench of oil and smoke, but the salt and iron temps of their fear when he was among them. The next time they crossed his border, he knew, it would not end with him retreating into the fog. The wound on Ika's shoulder closed slowly. The rains kept it clean, but each movement reminded him of the day the human's fire sticks had found his flesh. The ache was more than pain, it was a mark, a reminder of a new kind of predator that did not fight by the rules of the jungle. For several moons, the western border seemed quiet. The acrid scent faded, The metallic clanging fell silent, and the forest began to breathe again. But Akrid did not relax. Predators that retreat often return hungrier than before. The tigress raised the cubs with the same relentless discipline she had once shown him. They were larger now, their legs strong enough to follow her on short hunts, their playful wrestling slowly sharpening into the beginnings of real skill. Yet even in their innocence, aka saw the instinctive wariness in their eyes. The forest's peace had cracks, and they could feel it. Then the scent came back stronger, heavier. It was not the fleeting trail of hunters passing through, it was settled, rooted. Humans were not just crossing his border, now they were staying. He found the first sign on a morning patrol. A stretch of game trail he had walked countless times was broken by something unnatural. A rectangular pit dug into the earth, its bottom lined with sharpened stakes. The smell of blood clung to it, fresh, pungent. A young boar lay skewered at the bottom, its eyes glassy, its body bayed for something larger. AKA circled the trap, his tail lashing, reading the story in the mud. Human boot prints led in and out, careful, deliberate. This was not a random kill. This was bait. For him. That same night, he followed their trail deeper than before, slipping through bamboo thickets and weaving between fig roots as silent as mist. He saw their camp before he smelled at a cluster of canvas shelters, a fire crackling in the center, the flames throwing long shadows against the trees. There were 4 men to clean their long fire sticks, their movements slow and practiced. One crouched over a pile of wire and metal, twisting it into loops, and as the last sat with his back to the forest, a slab of meat roasting over the fire, its scent thick and sweet in the damp night air. Aka's muscles tensed, but he did not rush them. He watched, he listened. This was not a herd of deer to be scattered, nor a rival tiger to be driven out. It was a pack with tools and cunning, capable of killing from a distance. To face them head-on would be to step into their advantage. So he did what the jungle had taught him since cubhood. He began to hunt them the way they hunted him. On the first night, he circled wide, approaching from downwind. He slashed open one of their meat caches hung in the trees, spilling the contents onto the forest floor where scavengers would find it. The second night, he dragged away a snare and buried it deep in the mud of a creek bed, masking his tracks with flowing water. On the third night, he came closer, close enough to smell the sweat on their skin, to hear their slow breathing as they slept. He did not attack. Instead, he left his centered, deep, deliberate spray along the edge of their camp, and claw marks raked high into the trunk of a tree just beyond their firelight. By the fourth night, the men were restless. Their voices were sharper, their glances more frequent toward the shadows between the trees. They set more traps, moved their camp twice, and lit larger fires. The scent of fear was starting to mingle with their own, but aka knew fear alone would not drive them away. On the fifth night, the opportunity came. One of the men broke away from the group, carrying a bucket toward the stream. AKA followed, each step silent, each breath measured. When the man bent to fill the bucket, AKA moved fast and silent, a rush of muscle and stripes. He struck the water's edge with a roar that shattered the stillness, claws tearing the bucket from the man's hands. The human stumbled back, falling hard into the mud, scrambling toward the camp as AKA stood between him and the path, tail whipping, teeth bared. The other men came running, fire sticks raised, but by then AKA was gone, melting into the darkness, his roar still echoing through the trees. The message was sent. This forest was not empty ground, it had a ruler, and he was watching, yet Akka knew the battle was far from over. Humans were not like rival tigers who yielded once beaten. They would come again with more traps, more fire, more noise. And when they did, he would be ready not as prey, but as the predator they could never fully see until it was too late. The rains had gone, leaving the forest brittle under a hard, unrelenting sun. Grass crackled underfoot, streams ran shallow and sluggish, and the air carried a dry metallic tang that put every creature on edge. It was in this brittle season that the humans returned not as a handful of intruders, but as a force. AKA first sensed them in the early hours before dawn, when the forest still held its cool breath. The wind brought him their scent, acrid oil, metal, smoke, and something new, sharper, chemical, clinging to the leaves in a way no natural smell could. He moved quickly to the western ridge and stopped dead. From the high ground he could see movement between the trees. Dozens of men, not just the hunters with their long black firesticks, but others carrying bright metal canisters on their backs, hoses coiled at their sides. Behind them rumbled the growling wheeled beasts machines larger than any animal, their tires tearing deep scars into the earth. The humans were not here to pass through, they were here to take. AKA moved along the ridge, shadowing them. The machine stopped at the edge of the open glade, the same one that had once been his favorite hunting ground. Men dismounted, shouting to each other in their clipped, harsh voices. Then he saw it. Fire. Not the accidental spark of lightning, not the creeping flame of dry leaves and drought. This was deliberate, a torch pressed to the grass, flames licking high, devouring green in moments. The chemical scent thickened, choking the air, making Acre's eyes sting. Smoke began to billow, curling above the canopy like a dark banner. The wind shifted, and with it came another scent that made his blood run cold. The den. The smoke was drifting toward the fig tree hollow where the tigress kept the cubs. The fire was still far, but fire moved faster than any predator, and it respected no borders. Arca's muscles pulled in two directions at once. The hunter in him wanted to strike now, to drive into the humans' lines and scatter them before they could burn deeper. But the father knew that even one misjudged moment could mean the cubs would be trapped by flame. He turned from the ridge and ran, the forest whipping past in a blur of shadow and light. Birds exploded from the canopy above him, their wings frantic. The smell of smoke thickened as he neared the den. He found the tigress already on her feet, her ears flat. The cubs huddled at her belly. Without hesitation, they moved away from the creek, away from the wind's path, into the deeper ravines where the smoke could not follow so easily. They climbed a narrow deer trail along the rocks, the cubs scrambling, sometimes slipping, their tiny claws digging for purchase. The tigress nudged them forward, her body a barrier between them and the rising haze. AKA followed behind, his ears tuned for the crackle of flames and the snap of human boots. From the safety of the ridge above the ravine, he looked back. The fire was spreading faster now, the orange glow turning the lower trunks into black silhouettes against a moving wall of light. Figures moved in front of it, humans with their torches, driving the flames in deliberate lines. Behind them, the machines roared, their bulk pushing fallen logs aside, widening the wound in the forest. And then, through the smoke, one of them saw him. A shout cut the air, a flash of light, the crack of a stick. The shot struck the earth inches from his forepaw, throwing dirt into his face. The cubs froze in alarm, but the tigress herded them onward. Ika's roar answered the gunshot, deep rolling, carrying not just warning but defiance. The sound echoed through the burning trees, and for a moment the humans hesitated. But hesitation was not retreat. By nightfall, the fire had eaten a swath of forests larger than any clearing AKA had ever known. The air was thick with ash, the ground still warm beneath his paws. From the shelter of a high rock ledge, he watched the humans leave torches out, machines growling back the way they came, leaving behind a scar that would take seasons to heal. The cubs slept curled against the tigress, their flanks rising and falling in the rhythm of exhaustion. AKA stood guard at the ledge's edge, the glow of distant embers reflecting in his eyes. He knew this was not victory. The humans had not been driven out, they had simply finished for the day. They would return with more fire, more machines, more weapons. And when they came, he would be there. Not only to defend his kingdom, but to keep the flame from reaching what mattered most. The fire's scar still lay raw across the western edge of Aka's kingdom. Where once the air had been thick with the scent of bamboo and wild ginger, it now reeked faintly of ash and burned soil. The ground was soft in places where roots had rotted to black threads. And the silence there was heavier than any quiet Aka had known. No birds, no insects, only the whisper of wind through the skeletal remains of trees. But the fire had not broken him. It had taught him. The humans moved with patterns. They entered by the same paths, camped in the same clearings, set their traps along the same game trails. They relied on noise, numbers, and their weapons. Aka's strength had always been patience and silence. Now he would use those to bleed them from the shadows. It began with scent. On a moonless night, AKA followed their trail deep into the western clearing, where they had set their last camp. The fire pits were cold, the air stale with their musk, but their presence lingered in the trampled grass and scattered refuse. He moved through the clearing without sound, spraying his scent along the edges, clawing deep grooves into the remaining tree trunks, his mark laid over theirs. By dawn, any animal passing through would know the territory belonged to him, not them. The next move was bolder. He had learned the smell of their food stores: salted meat, dried fish, grains kept in heavy sacks. When they returned, he shadowed them from the tree line, waiting for the moment their attention fractured. One man moved toward the stream with a canister on his back. Another knelt by the fire, back turned. In 3 silent strides, AKA crossed the edge of the camp, seized one of the sacks in his jaws, and melted back into the shadows. By the time the humans realized the loss, The scent of the stolen food was already trailing miles into the forest. Then came the traps. The humans had set them cleverly, wire snares hidden under leaves, pits camouflaged with branches. Aka found them by smell and memory, dismantling them with careful swipes of his paws. Some he destroyed entirely, others he left intact but shifted subtly, disguising their placement so that even the humans might stumble into their own designs. The first sign his tactics were working came in their voices. Their shouts carried frustration now. Their fire burned hotter and longer at night, pushing back shadows that once pressed close. They began to move in tighter groups, never letting one man stray too far from the others. But Aka wanted more than to frighten them. He wanted to make them leave. On the seventh night, he came closer than ever before. A heavy fog clung low to the ground, swallowing sound, muffling movement. Aka's body was a silent rhythm. Step, pause. Step, until he was so near he could see the glint of their eyes in the firelight. A rustle in the far brush made one man turn his head. Aka slipped forward, low to the ground, and stopped just outside the fire's reach. When the man turned back, their eyes matamba to human, predator to trespasser. Aka's roar broke the fog, a deep rolling thunder that made the flames flicker. The camp erupted in shouts. Weapons swung toward him, but he was already gone, moving like water into the darkness. Behind him, he heard them fire into the trees, the cracks echoing through the clearing. None found their mark. By morning, the humans had packed their camp, their trail cutting westward out of the forest. Aka followed them as far as the ridge, watching from the cover of thick ferns as they crossed the open ground beyond. They did not look back. For now, the forest was his again, but Aka knew they would return. Humans always returned. He would be ready not with rage alone, but with the patience of a hunter who understood his enemy, and the resolve of a ruler who had something worth dying for. The cubs were no longer small enough to fit beneath their mother's belly. Their shoulders were lean but strong, their paws broad, and their play had begun to mirror the deadly precision of real hunts. The tigress led them on short excursions, now tracking a chittle herd to the edge of the grassland, practicing the slow, low stalk, and teaching them to still every muscle when the wind shifted. Aka watched them with a mix of pride and unease. Pride, because their movements carried the beginnings of grace and power. Unease, because the forest that had raised him was changing faster than they were growing. The western edge, though quiet for weeks, bore fresh scars. The humans had not returned in the same numbers, but their presence was marked in other ways. Fallen trees cut clean through at the trunk, the hum of distant machines at night, and trails of compacted soil that would take seasons to heal. These wounds in the forest were like silent roars, warning that the invasion was only paused, not ended. And now, another danger was pressing from the east. The scent came first, a deep, musky note layered with the salt of fresh kill. Aka followed it to the crest of a low ridge, where the earth was churned with paw prints almost as large as his own. A rival male had crossed into his territory, not just passing through, feeding here, claiming space. It was the worst timing. The cubs were old enough to wander, bold enough to stray, but too young to defend themselves. The tigress could guard them, but if the male found the den, instinct would drive him to kill the cubs, forcing her back into estrus, making the land his in both scent and blood. That night, Aka set his patrol to the east. He moved in a slow arc, laying fresh scent marks high on tree trunks, raking his claws deep into the bark. He roared 3 times in the darkness, long, rolling notes that warned any listener this ground had an owner. But he was not the only one sending messages. At dawn, he found the rival's marks layered over his own, the scent fresh and bold, a direct challenge. While the forest's predators circled each other, the prey grew restless. Herds shifted south, avoiding the areas where the two tigers' scents mingled. Boar trails bent toward the center of Aka's range, bringing with them more opportunistic hunters, packs of dholes, lean and restless after lean seasons. Twice in a single week, Aka and the tigress had to drive them away from the den. It was during one of these encounters that the cubs made their first real stand. A pair of dholes had broken from the pack, their teeth bared, eyes locked on the smallest cub. The young tiger froze at first, ears back, body low. Then, in a flash of instinct, it lunged, not with the strength to kill, but with enough force and sound to make the dog hesitate. The moment was all Aka needed to close the distance, his roar scattering the pack into the undergrowth. The cub trembled afterward, but the spark in its eyes was different, now no longer only a cub's curiosity, but the first glimmer of a hunter's will. Still, the dangers were stacking. Rival predators from the east, human expansion from the west. The center of Aka's territory was becoming crowded, the balance fragile. He felt it in the silence between the night's calls, in the way the wind carried scents that should never meet in the same place. As the moon thinned to a silver blade in the sky, aka knew that the next season would decide everything. If he could drive back the rival and keep the humans from cutting deeper, his cubs might grow to rule a forest still worth ruling. If he failed, his bloodline would scatter, and the jungle's voice would change forever. The time for warning roars was ending. The time for decisive strikes against both the tiger that threatened his cubs and the humans who burned his borders was coming fast. The air was wrong before dawn. It was thick, not with mist, but with a haze that carried the sting of smoke. Beneath it came two other scents, one heavy with musk and challenge, the other acrid, metallic, and human. They were coming, all of them. Aka rose from where he had been resting near the creek. The tigress was already awake, her ears flat, her gaze fixed toward the east. The cubs pressed against her legs, their bodies tense, sensing what was in the air. The rival male had crossed the eastern border under cover of night. His scent was everywhere, fresh, bold, layered over AK's own marks. He wasn't circling anymore, he was advancing. And from the west, the smell of humans thickened, joined now by the faint chemical bite of accelerants. They were converging. AKA had no choice but to split his focus. The tigress would take the cubs into the ravine to the south, where the walls of stone would shield them from both flame and claws. He would hold the center, meeting whichever threat reached it first. The rival came first. He emerged from the fog of smoke like a shadow pulled into flesh bigger than AKA remembered from the scent marks. His shoulders broad, his face crisscrossed with old scars. The growl that rolled from his chest was deep, almost subterranean. It was not a warning, it was a claim. AKA answered with a roar that cut through the smoke and carried into the trees. The sound made the forest pause just for a heartbeat before both tigers lunged. They collided with a force that shook the ground. Claws tore fur, teeth snapped inches from throats. The rival tried to drive AKA backward, to force him toward the western edge where the smoke was thickening. AKA twisted, using his shoulder to slam into the other's ribs. But the rival's weight bore down like a landslide. Then came the crack, sharp, unnatural. The humans had arrived. The rival froze for an instant, head jerking toward the sound. AKA didn't hesitate. He drove forward, slamming the other male onto his side, raking claws deep into his flank. The rival roared, thrashing, and broke free, vanishing into the wall of smoke as another crack split the air. The smell of fire surged. Through the haze, AKA saw the flicker of orange. Humans were moving through the trees, torches in one hand, fire sticks in the other. The flames spread fast, racing along the dry grass, feeding on the wind. Between the advancing fire and the lingering musk of the rival, AKA was being pressed into a tightening noose. He dropped low, vanishing into the undergrowth, moving not away from the humans but toward them. The crack of another shot rang out, but it was wild, blind. The smoke was his ally now. He circled wide, coming up behind the smallest group, a pair of men dragging a canister toward the flames. He struck like the forest itself had risen against them. One man went down hard, the other stumbling back, his torch flaring as it hit the ground. AKA crushed it under his paw, embers hissing in the damp soil. The men fled, shouting into the smoke, but the fire was spreading faster than fear. AKA moved toward the southern ravine, following the faint sound of the cubs' cries. Through the glow he caught sight of the tigress low tense. The cubs pressed between her and the rock wall. Relief surged through him, but there was no time to stop. The rival's roar came again, closer than before. He had circled through the fire's edge, his fur singed in places, eyes blazing. This time, there would be no pause. The fight was raw and desperate. Flames cracked and roared around them, sparks falling into their fur. Aka's muscles screamed with every strike, every twist, but the thought of the cubs pressed the pain into the background. He feinted left, then drove his weight into the rival's neck, forcing him to the ground. Claws dug deep, and this time he did not relent. When the rival finally went still, AKA staggered back, chest heaving. The smoke was thicker now, the fire too close. He turned to the tigress, and together they herded the cubs along the narrow rock path that led out of the ravine and deeper into the unburned forest. They did not stop until the glow was gone and the air was cool again. At the edge of a high ridge, AKA stood and looked back. The western sky still flickered with firelight, and the wind carried the faintest trace of human scent. The forest would bear new scars come morning, but for now his family was safe and the heart of his kingdom still beat. He raised his head and roared, not a warning, not a challenge, but a declaration to every creature still listening through the night. The kingdom lived, and as long as it did, so would he.